morning, ladies and gentlemen. You're all very welcome to this month's lecture. Can you believe it's actually our final lecture? I don't know where the time went. I hope you have all enjoyed the series. I will give details of next year's series and our field trip and that after the lecture this morning. Okay, so I'm delighted to welcome Professor Terrence Dooley from NUI. When you start researching the title Big Houses, he's one of the first names that crops up in a Google search. Terry is based in Maynooth University and he heads up the Centre for the Study of Historic Houses and Estates up there, and he has done a huge amount of fabulous work and published numerous books. Many of you may have seen one more recently on the burning of big houses. So Terry needs no more introduction from me. I'm delighted to hand you over to Professor Terrence Dooley.
Thanks very much, Julia. Good morning, and you're all very welcome. This morning, in the presentation or the lecture that I'm about to give, what I hope will come from this presentation is the centrality of land reform to Irish life, society and politics during the period of the existence of the Irish Land Commission, from its establishment under the 1881 Land Act until its dissolution in 1992. And beginning as a regulator of fair rents, free sale, fixity of tenure under the 1881 Land Act, it then evolved into the great facilitator of land transfer. But sometimes overemphasis on these two aspects of its work can sometimes camouflage its equal significance as the main instigator and architect of rural reform, bestowing upon it preeminence as the most important state body operating out of rural Ireland for much of its existence. And during that time, the Land Commission's long tentacles spread into every nook and cranny of rural Ireland, and arguably its ghost continues to do so up to the present day. So even though the Land Commission has been dissolved now for over 30 years, its archives have not been open to the public except on an extremely limited basis, and maybe increasingly so. Things are certainly looking up and they're getting better in that respect. But chiefly, this is one of the things that I want to address this evening as well, because the anomaly of this is difficult to explain, and the loss to Irish historical research is to be greatly lamented. In a very recent review of my book, which Julia just mentioned, Burning the Big House, Dr. Alan Warren, formerly of the University of York in England, commented, "If one had to choose a single piece of evidence to demonstrate the importance of land in Irish politics in the 20th century, it might be that the Land Commission records remain still closed to Irish citizens and scholars, 140 years after its founding in 1881. This exclusion is thinly justified by the Irish government, as has again been pointed out by Terrence Dooley. It is to be hoped this will draw attention to this embargo, redolent of the most secretive Anglo-Irish landlord before 1922. So again, let's hope so, because limited, but as I said, admittedly growing access has obstructed historians, as well as scholars from a wide variety of other disciplines, including, but not exclusively, geography, sociology, anthropolitics and political studies, in fully appraising countless topics, from the most rudimentary, such as the importance of the everyday work of the Land Commission, to the significance of the complex intersection between land questions and politics, especially after Irish independence in 1922. So the aim of this presentation, therefore, is fourfold. Firstly, to provide a summary overview of the origins of the Land Commission. Second, to describe in brief what the archive contains. Thirdly, to illuminate the importance of the Commission's records to any future understanding of the evolution of modern Ireland, with particular reference to research topics that have yet to be systematically researched. And finally, and by extension, to convince people like yourselves of the importance to continue to lobby in order to fully open the archives to the research public. So let us begin with the origins of the Land Commission. Under the 1881 Land Act, it was established, and I quote, as a body corporate and a court of record with the powers, rights and privileges of the High Court relating to matters within its jurisdiction, unquote. It was to consist of a judicial commissioner and 2 other commissioners, paid the very handsome salary of £3,000 per annum, with a central office in Dublin on Merrion Square, but with the power to hold sittings in any other part of Ireland. The Land Commission's initial work, as I said already, relating to the fixing of fair rents, is an area that has been reasonably well documented by historians. And suffice to say here that by reducing rents, on average by around about 21% or so from 1882, in a politically volatile climate, the Land Commission stabilised agrarian society during the turbulent land war era of the 1880s, and thereby, as Vincent Comerford puts it, mediating a change with an imperturbability unachievable by politicians increasingly susceptible to public pressures. The 1881 Land Act also made provision for the beginning of the transfer of land ownership from landlords to tenants. However, very little land was transferred. Landlords were not prepared to accept the price on offer, and tenants were generally unable to raise the 25% cash deposit during a period of economic crisis, or else they were reluctant to do so as long as the Land Commission threatened to lower rents, or promised to lower rents, depending on the perspective that you were coming from. And in response to this government interference, the financial institutions, wary of the plummeting value of agricultural land, closed all avenues of borrowing. In fact, panicky lenders, meaning banks and assurance companies and so on, began to call in their mortgages. The traditionally precarious position of Irish landlords now became critical. And in 1887, Sir Henry Gore-Booth of Lissadell and Sligo, for example, told the Cowper Commission, which had been appointed to inquire into the working of the earlier Land Acts, "I would be willing to sell every acre. It would be a great saving to me if I could get 23 years' purchase on the ordnance valuation, 1/4 added." So effectively, his class were now looking for a bailout. And as land questions moved from fair rents to tenant proprietorship, it was hardly surprising that under the 1885 Land Act, the Commission's role was expanded, and it became the body responsible now for the advancement of 100% loans to tenants to purchase their holdings, and for collecting the annual payments, or annuities at 4% interest over 49 years on behalf of the British Exchequer. Again, there was some movement in the terms of sales, but the conditions conducive to sale and purchase had not yet been put in place. The position of the Land Commission was then firmly established, and the increasing importance of its role recognised under the 1891 Land Act, when it was given permanent status and a central role in the governance of the Congested Districts Board, created under the same Act. And it was charged with addressing the problems of extreme poverty in the counties along the western seaboard from Donegal to Cork. And over time, this would include the relief of congestion through the migration of small, uneconomic farmers from west to east. And that's a topic we'll come back to later. So the Land Acts of 1881, 1885 and 1891 were largely unsuccessful in terms of land transfer. It was the 1903 Land Act, commonly referred to as the Wyndham Act, after its principal architect, George Wyndham, then Chief Secretary of Ireland, that dramatically expedited this process, resulting in a non-violent social revolution that culminated in the transfer of roughly 80% of Irish land from landlords to farmer occupiers by 1914. So Wyndham succeeded where others had previously failed, because he put in place the incentives that landlords had demanded, and which of course were agreed upon by tenant representatives. Landlords received very generous payments, up to 25 years purchase on their annual rental incomes, plus a 12% cash bonus, which is again tantamount to this idea of a government bailout. And these unprecedented prices meant that, for example, the 6th Duke of Leinster received an impressive £786,000 for roughly 41,000 acres In today's terms, you're probably talking about 60 million euros. And under a fairly complicated actuarial system, tenants were guaranteed that future annuities would be lower than their former rents. So they too were given the incentive now to purchase. And of course, it was the Land Commission that was the body that was responsible for the administration of transfer. While the origins and mechanisms of the 1903 Land Act and topics such as landlord investment behaviour have attracted a great deal of important scholarly attention in recent times from the likes of historians such as Tony McCarthy, many more crucial topics remain to be investigated, including, for instance, the flight of Irish landlords following the break-up of their estates, the resulting fate of big houses and domains, the reimagining of the designed rural landscape, much of which had dated to the 18th century, the impact on local towns and village economies denuded of resident landlords, their families and retinue, and the fallout from the redundancy of domestic servants, estate craftsmen and labourers, gamekeepers, woodsmen, bailiffs, and eventually churchmen and their congregations. And during the years of the First World War, the work of the Land Commission was in large part suspended, most particularly land purchase and the redistribution of land for the relief of congestion. And growing rural frustrations, especially amongst smallholders and landless labourers, helped fuel the latest phase of the extended land war from 1917. And this eventually forced the first Free State government to introduce a new Land Act of its own in 1923. Before this Act could be implemented, the Land Commission had to be reconstituted. And so on the 24th of July 1923, the Land Law Commission Act was passed, transferring all the powers of the Commission to the Free State government, placing it under the control of the Minister for Agriculture and dissolving the Congested Districts Board. Under the 1923 Land Act, the process of the final transfer of land ownership from landlord to tenant began, but it would take almost half a century more to actually complete. Now the Land Commission was given extraordinary powers to compulsorily acquire and redistribute all untended lands required for the relief of congestion. That means to bring farms up to a more viable level. After being voted into power in 1932, Fianna Fáil provided further impetus to land acquisition and redistribution with a Land Act of its own in 1933. It had been Fianna Fáil's declared intention from the 1920s to complete land purchase, to break up the large grazing ranches and distribute them as economic farms amongst young men and agricultural labourers, many of which they argued were being compelled to emigrate. So the Commission was therefore given more radical powers, and it could now acquire the domain lands, parklands and home farms that had been previously exempted under the 1923 Land Act. An abandoned big house could no longer be used as proof of residency, so absentee estates were particularly targeted. The stipulation that lands not used, and I quote, in the same manner as an ordinary farmer in accordance with proper methods of husbandry, unquote, ruled out those domain owners who had claimed exemption, for example, as stud farmers. Moreover, reforms introduced by the temporary Minister for Lands, Frank Aiken, increased the opportunity for allocating land to IRA veterans, ostensibly as reward for the role they had played in the independence struggle, a dimension of the longer revolutionary period that has really yet to be fully explored. And Fianna Fáil also had to tackle the redistribution of lands on numerous domains and estates which had been occupied or grabbed during the 1920 to 23 period, and upon which the great muddle of who was entitled to land had yet to be sorted. From 1933, the work of the Commission took on another important social dimension, the relief of Western congestion, through the migration of smallholders to the Midlands and the East. For the years for which statistics are available, from 1937 to 78, the Land Commission migrated over 14,500 farmers, mainly from areas of the West onto lands totalling over 382,000 acres in the East and Midlands. This was a social engineering project of some significance, and it wasn't easily achieved. The process of migration involved many difficulties, practical, legal and technical, of which not the least was the objection of smallholders and landless in the neighbourhood to immigrants being given land in which they considered they and their families should have a prior claim. So, for example, Gerard Boland of Fianna Fáil, Minister for Lands, announced a migration scheme from the west of Ireland to County Meath in 1938, and the people of Bohermeen and District formed an association and elected an all-party committee to object. Graffiti appeared on walls warning "No migrants for Allenstown" and "The Meath land for the Meath men." The national need, in other words, was not considered as great as local want in such circumstances. Timothy Linehan, TD of Fine Gael, had some sympathy for Land Commission officials when he said, "They," meaning the inspectors, "are in the midst of a seething mob of people, every one of whom expects to get land and every one of whom has at the back of his own mind the idea that he is able to work a little greater pull than another." Now, while much good work has been done on the topic of migration, Tony Varley's conclusion is extremely apt in the context of this paper. He writes, "Any assessment of the pressures brought to bear on inspectors and the land commissioners in individual cases, and with what effect, must await the release of the Land Commission records." Unquote. Now, as already suggested, the impact of the work of the Land Commission on the physical rural landscape, never mind the rural mindset, was enormous. The Land Commission's web spread so wide that it is conceivable there were very few families in rural Ireland that it did not at some stage or other impact their lives. For generations, there were farmers living in dread of the Commission compulsorily acquiring parts of their lands for the relief of congestion. Not only the former landlord class, but also extensive farmers who had previously purchased under the British Land Acts and who at different times found themselves possibly on the wrong side of the Cumann Gael, Fianna Fáil political divide. There were much larger numbers of smallholders, agricultural labourers and rural landless who lived in hope of getting land from the division of an estate, too often a false hope perpetuated by politicians for political capital, especially around election time. There were also unfortunate families who, often through no fault of their own, fell on hard luck, were unable to pay their annuities and lived in trepidation that the Land Commission would take back their land. And there were plenty of greedy neighbours, only too willing to encourage the Commission to do so. So in summary, under the Free State Land Acts, the Land Commission completed the transfer of tenanted land in the 26 county area and eventually reshaped the colonial landscape. It accomplished the latter by compulsorily acquiring and redistributing most of the 2.6 million acres of domain and untenanted lands that had remained in the former landed elites' ownership up to the revolutionary period. And they did this for the relief of congestion. This was invariably followed by the demolition of scores of big houses, or else their sale for a variety of new purposes, such as schools, training colleges, monasteries, convents and hotels. As Eamon Crook has explained, the full extent of this phenomenon cannot of course be revealed again until the records are more easily accessible. But there's no doubt that an intriguing history remains to be told, as are other interesting sidelights to redistribution, including the legacy of tensions over sporting and fishing rights in some areas that have continued to cause rancour up to the present day. The allotment of lands for the creation of hundreds of playing fields, ostensibly for all games and open to all organisations promoting sports and athletics, though former Land Commission official PJ Salmon strongly suspected, and I quote, that the majority of sports fields were allotted for GAA games only. An excellent topic in its own right for those interested in nation building. But at the end of the day, there is absolutely no end to the Land Commission's footprint in rural Ireland. So how did it work? Well, in truth, in a way much more complicated than we would have time to discuss today. But at the peak of its operations in the 1930s, the Land Commission employed in the region of 1,350 people, making it the largest state agency in Ireland. It was divided into several branches or sections, and while these branches were refashioned from time to suit changing circumstances, the principal ones remained the same. The Secretariat, for example, controlled the management and regulation of the personnel of the Commission. It prepared statistical information to address the hundreds of questions asked in the Dáil every year about estates to be divided, and it dealt with all correspondence. From 1923 to 39, an average of over 300 parliamentary questions per calendar year were tabled on the acquisition and division of estates. This number, should be added, doesn't take into consideration the fact that on numerous occasions individual TDs inquired about the possibility of the division of numerous estates in his or her constituency, which, if enumerated, would obviously greatly multiply the total. Hardly surprisingly, the Secretariat therefore had to deal with tens of thousands of letters every year. In 1943, a civil servant commenting upon the amount of what he called irrelevant correspondence that arrived in the Land Commission offices every day stated, "Unfortunately, the Land Commission is regarded in the rural mind as a sort of universal benefactor, competent to deal with every requirement, from the cleaning of a drain to the repair of an embankment, from the trespass of a neighbour to the making of a road." As a result, one can only imagine the richness of the social history available to the historian if such correspondence has survived. And we'll come back to that in a little while. The Acquisition and Resale Division dealt with the purchase and redistribution of lands. When Fianna Fáil came to power in 1932 with the ambition to increase land division to an annual target of 100,000 acres, P.J. Salmon thought himself fortunate to be transferred to this branch. "The basic fact," he wrote, "is that the land hunger of all small farmers elevated the work of the resale branch to a preeminence not really attained by other branches," unquote. And when in the year ended 31st of March 1935, a record 123,277 acres had been divided amongst 7,000 allottees, the then Minister for Lands, Joseph Connolly, told the Land Commission staff, "We are engaged in work of supreme national importance, and our efforts of today are building up the prospects tomorrow for our country's welfare." The Land Commission became central to the myth of nation building, and some sense of its unwritten agenda may be gleaned from Salmon's reflection on the Derry estate in Donegal, on which there had been, of course, a notorious mass clearance of tenants in the 1860s. And Salmon reflected, "It was wonderful to be involved in the restoration of the lands to Irish landowners." It's hardly surprising, therefore, that the Land Commission generated such a volume of records. It is estimated that in its Portlaoise office there are over 18,000 individual boxes containing all manners of records, including deeds, valuers' maps, general descriptions of lands, inspectors' reports, other records describing individual holdings and their buildings, providing details on local markets, transport facilities, wider local agricultural practices, particulars and conditions of sale, the allocation of fishing and sports rights, miscellaneous correspondence relating to a myriad of topics, requests for land, the fixing of boundaries, a sort of universal source of grievance where families fought, as Kavanagh put it, over who owned that half a rood of rock and no man's land, that could lead to violence and sometimes even murder, and the settling of rights of ways, as well as turbary rights, or the rights to cut turf. Records pertaining to litigation, or the possibilities or potential for litigation that had to be removed before a tenant became an owner-occupier, so that he would be left in full possession with a well-defined title to his land and appurtenances. And for purposes of the division of an acquired estate, a Land Commission inspector was sent into an area to gather all the facts he could about each prospective allottee who lived within a stipulated radius. Each applicant was interviewed to determine the number in his family, making the reports a genealogical source of some significance. The amount and type of stock that he held, and evidence of capital available to him to invest in any future holding. Potential allottees were, it seems, often more revealing about their neighbours, who were in competition with them than they were about themselves. One land commissioner claimed that when the inspector is going his rounds at his work, he inevitably hears the whole truth, for the competition for land is so keen that each applicant will see to it that his neighbour will not get away with his particular story, unquote. So again, these records will surely reveal extraordinary insights to the complex nature of Irish rural society and allow for a detailed analysis of community life at a given time, and maybe even a history of gossip and hearsay. The accounts branch dealt with the financial dealings of the Commission, while the collection branch garnered purchase annuities. Its statistics alone would be vital in understanding economic troughs during the depressed 1880s or at the height of the economic war with Britain in the 1930s. The solicitors branch looked after all legal proceedings, including the recovery of arrears and annuities. And these records might be used to ascertain, for example, whether the Land Commission was an improvement on the old landlord system in relation to benevolence towards defaulters. Dealing with a bureaucratic machine was probably even more intimidating. As Guinan and Miller have claimed, it is difficult to believe that many purchasers did not regret at one time or another the passing of a landlord who would accept the rent a few months late, unquote. There are also records relating to labourers and evicted tenants, the latter being the foot soldiers, of course, of the Land League, whose turbulent history remains to be fully elucidated. The purchase branch dealt with tenanted lands, the records of which include schedules of encumbrances and mortgages or debts, a sample of which L.P. Curtis Jr. used to great effect to analyse levels of landlord indebtedness in the 19th century. They thus inform on aristocratic life and living, the rise of English and Scottish insurance companies or assurance companies in Ireland, and the increasingly important role of banks and moneylenders. And one shouldn't overlook the foundation collection, or foundational collection, within the Land Commission records, that of the Church Temporalities Commission, which, after the passing of the Irish Church Act of 1869, took charge of the Church of Ireland's properties. So the first archive was therefore that of the Temporalities Commission, including the records of its predecessor, the Board of First Fruits, founded in 1711. So again, in summary, in their totality, the Land Commission records are a unique source that inform on everything from who owned the land and who worked it, to the impact of divergent agricultural and rural reform policies of the major political parties of the day. They enlighten on the shaping and redesign of physical and indeed mental landscapes. They map the creation and disappearance of designed landscapes around big houses, the reason for agrarian agitation and litigation, the migration of smallholders from west to east, the flight from the land when small farm life became unviable and unsustainable after independence, rural poverty and hardship, social inequality in general, the lives of women and children, the lengths some family went to in order to retain ownership of their farms, and the list could go on to research infinity. For instance, the records can reveal a whole new layer of complexity regarding our understanding of how the Irish Revolution of 1920 to 23 played itself out in the decades which followed. To what extent did the Land Commission, the body with the greatest power to enact social change, embrace that potential? Or did it simply become another pawn of local elites, including parish pump politicians, extensive farmers, gum-bean shopkeepers, the local Catholic clergy, too often friend of the wealthy and master of the poor? As newspaper reports testify, rural Ireland was seething with frustration, local jealousies, bitterness and anger as lands were divided. In the Dáil in 1949, Sean Moylan, former Minister for Lands, claimed, "I know that within the parish where I have lived for the past 20 years, it would be impossible for any outsider to buy a farm in it. The bidding is so keen." Moylan was concealing the fact in a diplomatic sort of a way that an outsider dare not bid for the land that locals wanted for themselves. No outsider need apply. Moreover, it's very probable that assiduous researchers with an eye for the forensic of land transfer and redistribution will reveal further the depths of political interference practiced in Ireland over generations after independence, providing there has been no culling of the records. The political rhetoric is easy to find in other sources. Land Commission correspondence, Dáil debate, newspaper columns and so on. Give you one example. One TD in the Dáil stating, "When land has been divided in my constituency, it's not the most deserving applicants that secure allotments. The principal key men and supporters of Cumann Gael invariably receive first preference. Prominent followers of Cumann Gael were brought, some of them a distance of 3 or 4 miles, and given land at Raleigh on the Gore Booth estate, while the claims of other small landholders and fishermen were ignored. Quite recently, when land was being divided on a Mitchell estate near Dromore West, the local Cumann Gael secretary was brought in from an outside estate and given a section of these lands to the exclusion of the more deserving applicants, including those who formerly obtained Conacre tillage there," unquote. Now, as I said, innumerable examples of this type of rhetoric can be found. The question is, how do we test the rhetoric against the reality? To what extent does the rhetoric match the reality? In his excellent 2020 study of a Land Commission migration scheme, Martin O'Halloran rightly voiced the opinion of many, and again I quote, that inevitably the perception of undue influence persists. And he rightly concluded that it can only be resolved by the opening up of the Land Commission records for fuller scrutiny. Finally, in this part of the talk, but no less important, the records are rightly considered to be of immense value as genealogical sources, both for local communities and the diaspora alike. In the view of Fiona Fitzsimons, Director of Find My Past Ireland, the records of the Irish Land Commission are probably the single greatest untapped resource for studying the population of Ireland in the 19th century, and a lodestone for academic and family historians. That means, by extension, that they have huge potential to offer the heritage and the tourism industries. How have the records been maintained? Well, until dissolution in 1992, all the Land Commission records were stored in 24 Upper Merrion Street, originally the Church Temporality Commissioner's headquarters. Under Section 6 of the Dissolution Act, the records were transferred to and lodged with the Minister and initially moved to the National Archives of Ireland building on Bishop Street, giving rise to the presumption that they would remain there. During the debate on the bill, Liam Hyland, who was then Fianna Fáil Minister of State at the Department of Agriculture, said, "I hope all these important documents will be properly stored in the new home we have found for them, and that the public will have access." The impression given was that there would be now more public access to the records. And it's worth noting that long before this, the records pertaining to the 6 counties of Northern Ireland had been transferred to the Public Record Office of Northern Ireland in the early 1920s. Unlike in the Free State, later Republic, records were openly accessible to researchers. John Grennan, one of Ireland's leading genealogists, later wryly remarked, "The Department of Agriculture," referring to the Republic, "fends off researchers, describing the records as private property. However, the department happily handed over pre-1922 Ulster records to the Public Record Office of Northern Ireland, and Proney has made them public, compounding, as he put it, the frustration of would-be researchers further south, able only to get a poignant whiff of what we're missing." Unfortunately, the southern records were not absorbed into the National Archives. Instead, they were eventually moved from Bishop Street to a warehouse facility in an industrial estate in Portlaoise, County Laois, where they are today. It soon became apparent that even though the Land Commission was dissolved, its records would remain closed. At the beginning of 2003, when former Taoiseach John Bruton of Fine Gael inquired of the Minister for Land, Joe Walsh, the reasons why the records are not open to scholars and others, he received the following reply. These records have not been formally handed over to the National Archives as they contain title documentation of all land acquired by the former Commission for distribution under the Land Purchase Acts. These records are referred to on a daily basis by my staff, who deal with ongoing queries relating to current and past transactions involving the former Land Commission." Unquote. In 2017, the Minister for Agriculture, Michael Creed, trotted out much the same answer to the same question. There were, he said, no immediate plans to make the 8 million or so records of the former Irish Land Commission generally available to the public for research or other purposes, as they are still classified as working documents and have not been handed over to the National Archives. Adding another layer of pretext in 2012, Minister for Agriculture Simon Coveney of Fine Gael informed the Dáil that the records are not available to the general public as they contain private, sensitive information and are protected by the Data Protection and Freedom of Information Acts. Now, Section 8.2 of the 1986 National Archives excludes from the terms of the Act records over 30 years old which contain information that might cause distress or danger to living persons on the ground, that they contain information about individuals or would or might be likely to lead to damages for defamation. But still, Coveney's answer was laced with irony, given that around the same time the government had no hesitation in opening the IRA pension files for the decade of commemoration, files that are at least as sensitive, but perhaps politically not as damaging. Are there too many political skeletons? In 1977, Hugh Gibbons of Fianna Fáil expressed his concerns to Patrick Donegan, Fine Gael Minister for Agriculture, that the Land Commission have no record of properties purchased by companies not requiring their consent, which in the main are semi-state companies, philanthropic bodies, the scheduled banks and companies which obtain a certificate from the Minister for Industry and Commerce that they are acquiring land for industrial purposes. Now, this is just one possible area with delicious research potential in relation to political shenanigans. It's perhaps unfortunate that the positive work done by the Land Commission has too often been tainted by charges of this type of political interference. In 1984, in a land bill debate, Charles MacDonald, Fine Gael in the Shannon declared of the Commission, their scope for changing the face of Ireland was readily recognised, but because of never-ending shenanigans, their demise will not be missed. Now, I don't think this is fair to those who worked in the Land Commission, but I'm not so confident about it in relation to politicians who at least attempted to manipulate the situation. Almost 2 years ago, in June 2021, Minister for Agriculture Charlie McConalogue announced in the Dáil that the department is examining the possibility of digitising certain key search aids, which will enable electronic searches to be carried out by members of the public in order to ascertain if specific records exist. The announcement received very little traction at the time, but at the beginning of January 2022, a time that is often synonymous with the opening of archives, another opportunity for political capital was taken to announce the government's intentions in the Irish Times. And this time, Minister McConalogue announced that he had set aside €100,000 to begin the process of digitising the search aids. And some historians and genealogists got excited on social media, and perhaps rightly so, that a step was being taken in the right direction. But somehow they missed the point that all the key search aids in the world are useless if the records themselves are not accessible. It's a bit like showing somebody the index of an important book but refusing them access to the main text. Or imagine the consternation of the historians of the revolutionary period, who over the last decade or so have greatly reappraised their understanding of the 1920 to 23 period through the release of the Bureau of Military History records. Imagine their consternation if they had been told, we have just digitised these wonderful indexes revealing who was involved in the War of Independence and the Civil War, but you're not allowed to actually see the witness statements or the IRA pension files. More importantly, attention should have been drawn to what Minister McConalogue said in his June speech, which was most perturbing. I quote, "In many cases, records were still stored in their original metal boxes, which over time had become damaged through handling and presented a risk to the documents within them and to staff handling them." Fears about the state of the records and how they have been conserved and preserved had been voiced down the generations. The first recorded Dáil question that I have been able to find was asked as far back as July 1958 by James Dillon, the then leader of Fine Gael, who worried about the safekeeping of the records and suggested that they should be microfilmed. The Minister for Lands, Erskine Childers, assured him that he would take the advice of the director of the National Library and some of our historians. But in the meantime, he said the importance of these documents is fully appreciated in the Land Commission and every possible care is taken of them. The documents are preserved in a special record branch of the Land Commission where they are fully indexed and filed in steel boxes which are kept in strong rooms. I can assure the deputies these documents are in good hands. But neither Childers nor his successors seem to have been aware of K.D. Buckley's seminal 1952 paper published in Irish Historical Studies, or at least they chose to ignore it, which revealed that storage conditions in the Merrion Street offices were far from ideal. He found that there were over 40,000 maps and records packed into sacks, boxes, trunks, loose bundles and tea chests. And in 1990, in another report on the Land Commission records, it was stated that the registers and indexes were the core administrative finding aids to estate boxes, maps, schedules of holdings and other material. But as such, they have been subject to much wear and tear, with page corners frequently eroded. And this, of course, could mean the loss of crucial detail. The 1990 report stated quite bluntly that storage conditions vary greatly from one area to another, and the quality of shelving and degrees of temperature and humidity and cleanliness have had a marked impact upon the general condition of the records, as in some instances has the manner in which they have been packaged for storage. The Land Commission building is centrally heated, with the exception of the basements, but because the heating system is peat-fired, records throughout the building have accumulated layers of peat dust. So while the Land Commission records may now be stored under appropriate archival conditions, previous reports clearly indicate this was not always the case. They were, and they are, still working records, handled on a regular basis, and best practice in preservation and conservation was not always a priority. They are still working records, not yet defined as historical manuscripts, which means they continue to be handled as working records, and this can only compound damage already done. And K.D. Buckley found something else that has been lost in the subsequent discourse. That, and I quote, "Scarcely any of the Land Commission's correspondence has survived. It appears that a large amount was pulped about 8 years ago," is what he concluded. Now, this would have been towards the end of World War II, when presumably paper shortages led to this calamitous decision. And Buckley's claim was later substantiated by the aforementioned P.J. Salmon in his Land Commission memoir, who stated that further pruning of estate files was authorised in the late 1960s by the Revesting Branch. and this surely represents a monumental loss to the social history of Ireland. So, in conclusion, the fact that so many records may already have been lost and that others are obviously already in a fragile condition, a fact noted by Michael Creed, the Minister for Agriculture, as I said, back in 2017. This surely points to the need to digitise them as a matter of urgency. After all, the Land Commission was the body that gathered the richest social history of the country for a period of over 100 years, the most pivotal period in modern Irish history, reaching from the beginning of the Land War to the decades beyond Ireland's entry to the European Economic Community. These are the records that document the modernisation of Ireland, that some might say reveal its very soul. They are at least as important as the records of the revolutionary period, which have rightly benefited from huge capital and personnel investment in the last decade or so. In fact, it may very well be the Land Commission records that ultimately define the history of how the Irish Revolution played itself out in the decades after independence. After all, the Land Commission affected considerably more families and lives than the War of Independence and the Civil War put together. They are, in so many respects, the founding records of the Irish state, and they deserve to be treated with that respect. Thank you.